Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we'll be talking about the structure of the Bible in our continuing series of how we got our Bible. The first century historian, Jewish historian Josephus, in his writing Contra Appian, Appian was a fellow who had written some things against the Jewish people. He's defending Judaism, and he says, "For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us disagreeing from and contradicting one another, as the Greeks have, but only 22 books which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine." Now, he goes on to talk about some other books that had been written, also by the Jews, telling the history in more recent times, but those other books did not have this same stamp of having been believed to be from God, believed to be divine. The books then that he is describing in the Hebrew Bible, you have first of all the Torah, that's Genesis through Deuteronomy. Next there are the prophets, the way you say that in Hebrew is the Navi'im. And the way they count the prophets, books like Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings, those are part of the prophets. But also the more traditional prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then what they call the 12. They count that as one book. What we call the minor prophets, they refer to as the 12. And notice they're counting them a bit different. They're not counting 1st and 2nd Samuel as two books. That's one book, and 1st and 2nd Kings. And so you've got the Torah, the Navi'im, that is the prophets, and finally the Ketuvim, the writings, what you said in Hebrew is the Ketuvim. And these are books like Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, but also books like Esther and Daniel. Esther because it's read at certain feast days. This is a collection called the Megillot that are in the writings that are read at special times of the year. And then Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, which was counted as one book, and the United Book of Chronicles. And so these are the books that Josephus was describing, the same books that make up our Old Testament. So our English Old Testament, even though it's arranged differently, we still have the Pentateuch, or if you want to call it Torah, that works well, as well, same collection. Historical books we put into a different distinction, Joshua all the way through Esther, which are telling historically the story of the Bible. After that, we have the poetic books, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, all books that largely contain poetry. And even though they also contain poetry, the prophets, which are both poetic, but also these are prophets, and we subdivide these into the major and minor prophets, Isaiah all the way down to Malachi. Now, when we compare our Old Testament with our New Testament, we find an interesting correlation. It's not a chronological correlation as much as it is a topical one, where first you have the foundational books. The first 5 books of the Torah are foundational to the Hebrew Scriptures in the same way the 4 Gospels tell the story of Jesus. They are foundational to the New Testament. Next, you have a historical section, what we call the historical books in the Old Testament. The book of Acts tells the rest of the story. In the Old Testament, we had the poetic books. In the New Testament, we have the epistles. They give a practical application of that foundation in history. In a sense, the poetic books sort of do the same thing, although I would suggest the prophets are really the application to the law. But I'm going to go with both the Old Testament and New Testament have a focus on the future. The Old Testament with the prophets. Now they're not always just about the future, but this is a general correlation. And of course, New Testament, the book of Revelation, we tend to think of as picturing the future. Now, the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first 3 of those are known as the Synoptic Gospels because they sort of take the life of Christ in essentially the same way. There are differences, and then John is sort of standalone as we compare these. There are differences, as I said. Matthew sees Jesus as the king. Not to say Mark, Luke, and John don't do that, but in Matthew it's his primary emphasis. Mark's primary emphasis is to see Jesus as the servant of the Lord. Luke, I think, primarily sees Jesus as a teacher, and I would add maybe storyteller. Remember that all the long parables, the story parables, are in Luke, and many of them exclusive to Luke. And then John's emphasis is to see Jesus as the Son of God. In Matthew, his readership seems to be primarily toward the Jews. A case has been made for Mark having his primary audience, that of the Romans. In fact, there have been some who've suggested maybe Mark wrote initially in Latin. I don't think there's enough evidence to show that. But I do think there's enough evidence to show that he is directing his message to his Roman readers. Luke, I think perhaps to the Greeks, and John a much more inclusive audience, directing his gospel account to everyone, that is to the world. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they focus primarily and almost exclusively, I would say, on Jesus' ministry in Galilee, up until you get to Jesus coming to Jerusalem, and then the Passion Week and the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. In John, we find that Jesus is both in Galilee and Jerusalem, and it's back and forth and back and forth. Time-wise, likewise, Matthew, Mark, and Luke mention only one Passover during the ministry of Jesus. Now, Luke does mention a Passover when Jesus was 12 years old. I'm not counting that. But during the ministry of Jesus, you have only one Passover. John mentions a number of Passovers and other feasts, which lead us to think that the ministry of Jesus was perhaps around 3 years. Could have been a little bit less, could have been a little bit more, but just counting Passovers means that we have multiple years in the ministry of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke compress that and only show one Passover, the last one that is mentioned. Now, Paul's epistles, he gives us a number of epistles, and again, they're arranged not chronologically, but thematically. You have Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Galatians that talk about salvation, Romans and Galatians especially, but also the Christian life. Then I have the prison epistles, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. That's a sort of a collection unto itself. Lots of reflection in there. Things about salvation in the Christian life, but they are more reflective. The Thessalonian epistles I like to refer to as the eschatological epistles. That's a big word, meaning they have an emphasis on prophecy, and they certainly do have that emphasis. And then finally, the pastoral epistles are Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. Timothy and Titus are workers. We could call them perhaps pastors, to whom Paul writes. And then Philemon, that's a personal letter writing to Philemon about him getting back together with his runaway slave and treating that slave now as a brother. So those are Paul's epistles. Notice I did not include Hebrews, even though Hebrews came to be associated with Paul. Most people today don't believe it was actually literally penned by Paul in the same way that these other epistles were. And so that brings us to the general epistles, and notice we have Hebrews, again, talks about salvation. I think it is a lot of Paul's theology, but perhaps worded by somebody else, written by someone else. In the case of Hebrews, the author is not known to us, even though it was known to the original recipients. James, that talks about faith and works. 1 Peter is the book about suffering. 2 Peter is another eschatological epistle, a lot about the things about the future that are in 2 Peter. And then the epistles of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude speak of the Christian life. So that the general epistles, Paul's writing primarily to a Gentile audience. Paul's writing largely to a Gentile audience. When we come to the general epistles, they are writing largely to a Jewish audience with oftentimes the same themes and yet expressed very differently because of the different audience. Now, the chapter divisions were not written by the original writers. Stephen Langton, he was the professor at the University of Paris, eventually became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he gave us the chapter divisions. They were also applied to the Vulgate and then adopted by Wycliffe in his translation, the translation that came from him in the late 1400s. There were some differences in the Psalms. That was, The chapter divisions there were a bit different, and rightfully so, because there are certain psalms which in our Bible have been divided into separate chapters, which may have initially been actually one psalm. For example, Psalm 42 and 43, I think very likely originally started as one psalm and may have been divided for liturgical purposes. It's still the same song. We haven't lost any of it, but it's been subdivided into two psalms. You know how sometimes in an old-fashioned church you'd be reading from the hymnal, where they would be singing, and they would say, today we're only going to sing the first three stanzas and we're not going to sing the others. They're not saying the others are bad, they're just not going to sing them for the purposes of that particular liturgy. Now, verse divisions, first of all, Rabbi Isaac Nathan, a Jewish rabbi, and he added verse divisions in the Hebrew scriptures in the year 1448, around that time. And then Robert Stephanus, coming in the next century, used Nathan's system for the Old Testament, except for the Psalms again, a little bit of difference in the Psalms. For example, in a Hebrew Bible, the superscription is numbered as a verse. In our English Bibles, they are not counted as a verse. They're sort of given, and then the verse 1 starts immediately after that. So when you have a Psalm of David, we don't count that as verse 1. That just comes before the verse. Stephanus used Nathan's system for the Old Testament, except for the Psalms, and then he added verses for the New Testament in 1555. And that makes it very convenient so that I can talk about John 3:16 and what that says in that particular verse. It becomes very helpful for us when referencing the scripture, but we ought to remember those were not part of the original, so we should not treat them as sentence or paragraph divisions. Try to ignore them in that sense, but make use of them in an appropriate way in order to tell us where you're reading from. And so I think they are a useful tool.